For a generation of kids, he was the ultimate superhero, the coolest dude around, and a hit with the ladies. The series following his exploits was a huge success, spawned a popular spin-off, and has produced some of the coolest toys from the 1970s. And if you ever hear this sound effect, you'll immediately think of the $6 Million Man. The $6 Million Man was a defining action-adventure series of the 1970s. It ran for 5 seasons, making it one of the longest-running shows with a science fiction element for that decade, and was a genuine pop culture phenomenon. For decades, Steve Austin meant the Bionic Man, rather than some stone-cold wrestler.
Don't give me that skeptical scientist look. Neither of us was aware that your lab assistant was a robot until I discovered the real Linda at Franklin's complex.
Martin Caidin's novel Cyborg was first published in 1972, and the rights for a TV adaptation were quickly snapped up as the basis for a 90-minute telemovie with the working title Some Dude Choose a Match to Look Cool, but later changed to the snappier sounding The $6 Million Man.
Out there, just before the sun comes up. It's just like being up there on the moon again.
Astronaut Colonel Steve Austin, who was famous for walking on the moon on Apollo 17, was now a test pilot who was horribly injured in a plane crash and is rebuilt using bionic parts. A procedure that cost how much? $6 million with deductible. Jesus, that's US healthcare for you. The telemovie was not an action-packed affair for the most part, but instead spent a good proportion of its runtime dealing with the aftermath of Steve Austin's accident. The surgery, the behind-the-scenes wrangling over the cost, the motivations of the government agency footing the bill.
Certain jobs where the use of ships, planes, multiplicity of personnel would be inappropriate.
Steve Austin's personal physician, Dr. Rudy Wells, is responsible for putting Steve back together again after his boo-boo, with 2 nuclear-powered bionic legs, a bionic right arm, and a bionic eye complete with a zoom lens and infrared abilities, but no notch or headphone jack. Wells was eventually played by 3 different actors over the years, but in the pilot it's veteran actor Martin Balsam, sparring with Darren McGavin as Spencer. Oliver Spencer is a dry and detached spy master who's been waiting for the raw materials for his bionics project, like a hillbilly waiting by the side of the highway for dinner to show up.
Are you going to ask for volunteers?
No. Accidents happen all the time. We'll just start with scrap.
Spencer wants a single super spy to handle his most dirty missions. We're not talking about laundry duties or mucking out the pigs, though I'm sure Steve Austin would be happy to do those sorts of jobs. He's just that sort of guy.
Yeah.
Steve Austin in the original movie is mainly a man in a hospital bed being mopey about losing 2 legs, an arm and an eye, and not really happy about being turned into a cyborg.
Now, you all have given me a gift, and I thank you very much. But now what is the price tag?
He's upset at being thought of as a freak, a monster, Frankenstein, Humpty Dumpty, a kit bashed special, Lego Technics man, Cyborg Mr. Potato Head, etc. I mean, I guess the nurses in this hospital weren't the most sensitive people. This is driven home to Steve when he first uses his bionic powers to save somebody from a car wreck.
What are you?
Body horror and shame are something you don't associate with the happy-go-lucky series that eventually follows. But in the pilot, there's a melancholic atmosphere. A reluctant rescue mission in the desert both tests Steve's newfound abilities and gives him back his mojo. Steve still doesn't want to be a government agent, but you know. Lee Majors had been a rising star, mainly appearing in folksy western-type shows, and here he gets to be a folksy astronaut. The new Bionic Man, at a cost of $4, $5, $6 million thanks to cost overruns, kickbacks, bribes and embezzlement, has nuclear-powered limbs, a 20-to-1 zoom and infrared vision in his bionic eye, can run 60 miles per hour, and with his bionic right arm can hurl shit farther than an angry toddler denied candy. The effect of Steve using his arms and legs was usually shown in slow motion, accompanied, eventually, by a unique sound effect. While Steve's prosthetics are amazing for 70s technology, he doesn't have built-in transmitters or computers. What he sees with his tricky eye is only seen by Steve in the moment. It's advanced, but not that advanced. When the show was made, computers were bulky things the size of a wardrobe, with data stored on tape reels, and according to Gilligan's Island, built from coconuts and palm fronds. The TV movie was very successful, and 2 more TV movies quickly followed, this time produced by Glenn A. Larson, who was instructed by the network to make Steve Austin into a super spy. It was at this time that Richard Anderson debuted as Austin's boss, Oscar Goldman.
That's the way we operate, Steve.
That's not the way I operate.
Steve, you're special, but you're not that special. We can't break the rules for one man.
Then you get yourself another.
Initially, the relationship between the two was slightly prickly, but by the time the weekly series came along, they were the best of buds. Goldman often called Austin pal, not in a confrontational Liverpudlian sort of way, but out of bromantic affection. Oscar and Steve would hang out a lot, sometimes going on double dates together, and even vacations, like the time Steve went dune buggying and Oscar dug a hole in the desert.
Well, what really interests me is watching Oscar Goldman dig holes in the ground.
Oscar spends a lot of time in episodes vacillating between hard-nosed bureaucrats sending Steve on suicide missions and standing around radios awaiting news on Steve. Alan Oppenheimer appeared from time to time throughout the first few seasons as Dr. Rudy Wells, but you might know him better as the voice of Skeletor on Masters of the Universe.
I think we should spend these last few minutes together.
What last few minutes?
The ones we're gonna have while I'm tying you up.
Spy antics aside, these first TV movies got us closer to the series we came to love, but with this intro and theme song,
He's the man. He's the man.
the lowish budget is offset by a liberal use of stock footage from Universal's movie library. But what's more off-putting is if you watch the syndicated versions, they have an immense amount of reused and redubbed footage inserted to pad out the runtime.
24 hours after the very militant, very committed profit from this project will this destination as per the...
And they originally didn't rate as well as the pilot.
Catch him if you can, beat him if you can, love him if you can.
The $6 million man almost became a tax write-off there and then, but broadcast network ABC ordered a 13-episode season to screen from early 1974. The weekly series was now produced by later Star Trek movie producer Harve Bennett, and now featured a lot of the series' familiar elements. The theme music by Oliver Nelson, along with the iconic credit sequence.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him.
Iconic is an overused word, especially by me, but this sequence and its narration and the graphics, they've all become legendary. Every time you hear the words,
We have the technology.
or
Better, stronger, faster.
it's referencing the intro to this series. Once the $6 Million Man became a proper weekly show, everything was bedded down fairly quickly. Lee Majors was allowed to play the role closer to himself, a modest, charming man, a little folksy, polite, only occasionally snappy. He also almost never smiles, just flashing a folksy smirk. Steve has a way of explaining his abilities to gobsmack onlookers without dwelling on it.
There's something different about you. What is it?
That's my accent.
Steve Austin was no longer a super spy. He was more of a troubleshooter working for Oscar Goldman at the OSI, the Office for Scientific Investigation. While that occasionally meant missions to space, Cold War spy antics or other missions for Oscar, the show quickly settled into a format that many of these adventure shows loved, which was the extraordinary person who wanders into people's lives to help out, usually in a way that involves some 1970s zeitgeist thing woven into the story. So, while Steve might be after some Cold War spy, the actual episode involved dune buggies, Winnebagos, roller derby, America's bicentennial, lumberjacks,
What do I do? Call on the Marines? No, give me a little time to get established as a lumberjack.
steelworkers, that sort of thing. Always with the idea that some espionage MacGuffin was involved, but really we just want to see Steve Austin rolling logs down a river as a lumberjack. Steve Austin had famously walked on the moon before his fatal crash. During the series proper, Steve travels into space more times than Cheech and Chong combined. He's also rather accident-prone, judging by the number of times he's involved in a plane crash, making even Harrison Ford's pilot safety record look enviable. Steve Austin quickly turns into the bionic version of Lee Majors. He rarely has long speeches, is friendly, and never cruel. He's occasionally caught out in moments of patronizing sexism.
Not just because you're a woman.
So it's my fault because I'm a woman driver. Hi.
Hello.
In short, the dude was a model 1970s hero. He wore casual clothes, lots of denim, slacks, wide collars, an open shirt revealing body hair. He even sported a porn star mustache for the show's 4th season.
That's all I need. A high-powered lawyer messing around at a time like this.
Yeah, with that new guy and his gang trying to muscle in.
The plots in The $6 Million Man are not what you could ever call complicated. Some episodes would at least give us interesting characters with their own stories, but you'd also get characters so thin that you'd get paper cuts, particularly in stories set in small towns requiring small-minded villains.
You still think Bigfoot's a hoax?
I don't know what to think.
$6 Million Man was a roving show where most of the time Steve went to the action, usually in locations unique to the episode rather than filming on standing sets like Star Trek or Bonanza. Oscar's office was one of the few sets we saw often, and usually just as a place to brief Steve on some espionage operation that would require Steve to go undercover as a lumberjack, cop, moonshiner, mercenary, or some other job that required Lee Majors to chew on a match for absolute authenticity.
Well, now, if I were that sort of person, I'd be kind of foolish to let on, wouldn't I?
The show occasionally went for heartwarming, particularly when Kenneth Johnson was involved as producer. But for the most part, $6 Million Man nearly always ended with a slow-motion action sequence. Slow motion was great since it helped make the episodes fit their required length much more easily. Lee Majors is great in the slow-mo action scenes. It's not always him, and sometimes it's a little obvious that it's not him, but when it is, he sells the shit out of it. The slow-motion scenes here and in shows like Kung Fu inspired a generation of kids to have their own slow-motion battles in playgrounds, all the while making the distinctive Bionic Man sound effect. Steve's a 70s ladies' man.
Now take off your clothes.
And often ends an episode by walking off with the guest star. He's not particularly flirty, but the man knows his effect on women, and of course, the star almost always ends up with a girl. If there's an attractive woman in the episode, she's usually single and probably will go on a date with Steve at the end. Even if the woman is a recent widow, or originally aligned somehow with the villains of the episode, Steve almost always manages to talk them into helping him and, of course, dating him. And then they're never heard from again. It's probably down to Steve's deodorant of choice, Moist Triangle, which has a half-life of 3 days before it decays, producing an odour equivalent to a rotting durian. Actually, that would explain a lot.
You're a great man.
Tell me something, Colonel. What makes a woman attractive in your world?
A woman needs intelligence, sense of humor.
Physical attributes?
Well, every little bit helps.
Only occasionally would there be a deeper connection with the guest actress, but the one that mattered the most was professional tennis player Jaime Sommers.
Jamie.
A childhood flame that Steve reconnected with and fell in love with at the end of the second season.
It always is when friends meet again. But lately, it's gone flat for me, Jamie.
Sommers, played by Lindsay Wagner, was injured when she and Austin went skydiving. I mean, didn't somebody warn her about Austin and planes? Steve pleads with Oscar to help her out, and after some emotional begging and some undisclosed favours, Jamie receives some new legs and an arm, but instead of Steve's bionic eye, she gets super sensitive hearing, which means she can hear this.
Sweet Jamie, I'll love you forever. I know we'll never part.
But I can't let Jamie get into that kind of danger.
You gave me your word.
The cost of her bionic augmentation is never revealed, apparently smaller parts, and also because Lee Majors might get the shits if he ever found out they spent more on her.
I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. The bionic ear you both gave me.
Jamie was killed off at the end of her two-part story arc during the show's second season.
I love you, Jamie.
Sweet Jamie, I'll love you forever.
God, I will never again criticize the intro song to The Fall Guy. Such was the response from the public, and a million fan letters sent to the ABC network by Death Stranding creator Hideo Kojima that Bennett was told to bring her back, which is exactly what happened at the start of the $6 Million Man's third season. This being the 70s, there had to be some bullshit reason to stop Steve and Jamie from rekindling their relationship. She's lost most of her memory, so Steve has to watch while the brilliant and apparently thirsty young doctor who saved Jamie's life, who knows that she and Steve are engaged, moves in for their kill. Of course, by this time the $6 Million Man had become a smash hit show, so why not go for a spin-off?
I can't remember what it was like to be in love with you.
The obvious take was to give Jaime Sommers her own series, and that's how we ended up with sister show The Bionic Woman, which would be made alongside The $6 Million Man until both shows ended in 1978.
So it begins.
Bionic Woman would end up running 3 series, with several crossovers between the shows for Bionic Woman's first 2 seasons. A multi-episode story would begin on one show, and then the conclusion would be on the other series. Lindsay Wagner and Lee Majors would appear on each other's series in various episodes until Bionic Woman moved to NBC for what ended up being its final season. A popular rumour implied that an executive at ABC hated Bionic Woman and cancelled it, and then moved to NBC and cancelled it again. Richard Anderson and Martin Brooks appeared as their characters on both series, where their wigs became even more obvious.
Jamie, get back in bed.
I feel fine.
No, you let me be the judge of that. All your tests aren't in yet.
Bionic Woman's setup was that Jaime Sommers moved back to Ojai and lived in a carriage house next to Steve Austin's parents, who are now established as having been her legal guardian since she was 16, which would make Steve and Jamie, who were engaged at one point, more or less brother and sister. How modern. Bionic Woman, the character in later the series, was the baby of $6 Million Man writer Kenneth Johnson, who would go on to initially oversee the Bionic Woman and later the Incredible Hulk, the original V miniseries, and the TV version of Alienation. The Bionic Woman show is a little more touchy-feely than the $6 Million Man, playing to Lindsay Wagner's strengths, whereas Steve Austin was often a strong silent type. Another difference between the two Bionic series really betrays when the show was made. People are really hands-on with Jamie. Bionic Woman was also a very popular show, with Lindsay Wagner winning an Emmy Award for her portrayal of Jaime Sommers, and that's despite the show getting cancelled so often you'd think it was a Netflix original. Both Bionic series were big hits for most of their run, and there were attempts to make even more spin-offs, like The Bionic Boy and A Bionic Dog. The $6 Million Man is unique in that one of the things that it's most remembered for is a sound effect. Very few TV shows, then or now, have sound effects that are synonymous with that show. There's the original Star Trek and Doctor Who. The $6 Million Man has one. It's the Bionic Man sound effect, a single sound effect that plays whenever Steve uses his super strength. It's been heard in other things like 80s cartoons and parodied from Here to Mars, but for many people that sound is that of the Bionic Man or the Bionic Woman. The funny thing is, the first time the sound is used, it's from a robot attacking Steve Austin. It wasn't used to denote the bionic powers until the second season, and then only occasionally. But from the third season, the sound editors forgot all restraint and just used it all of the time. Like when you teach a pet to ring a bell to get a treat and you instantly regret it. In most episodes, Steve Austin was better, stronger, faster than his opponents, and usually able to brute force his way through most situations. He'd often hold back on revealing his bionics wherever it was possible, unless they could get a joke out of it, in which case the need for secrecy was conveniently overlooked.
How's that gut for a nice long pass, huh?
Sure.
Take off.
When must have caught it?
Occasionally there would be a foe that would make Steve work for a living. There was the $7 Million Man, a former race driver who had 4 bionic limbs but wasn't able to mentally handle the extra power he had at his disposal.
You know what's really driving me nuts? What? You're what's driving me nuts, Stevie boy.
Steve's own bionics weren't perfect, for example. Extreme cold would slow him down considerably. Robots were a popular way to level the playing field. Back in season 1, we had a scientist, Dr. Dolans, who created a robot duplicate of one of Steve's friends, played by John Saxon, in the episode Day of the Robot, which gave us for the first time, but not the last time, the popular shot of a face falling off to reveal a robot underneath.
When did you first suspect he was a robot?
Well, he squeaked when he walked.
Dolans later returns to unleash a robot duplicate of Oscar Goldman, which of course Steve fights and eventually defeats.
How did you know which one of us was me?
Robots don't sweat when they're nervous.
In the later years, the $6 Million Man, along with the Bionic Woman crossovers, found 3 very popular opponents they could add to make certain episodes into major viewing events.
My people named him Sasquatch. You call him Bigfoot.
It gets a little complicated, but yeah, Bigfoot was a part bionic being created by some aliens hiding out in the woods, led initially by Stephanie Powers. Steve and Bigfoot had some massive fights, but in the end became friends. Bigfoot was played at first by Andre the Giant and later Ted Cassidy, and he was a huge success, so he was brought back several times to face off or fight against Steve Austin. These shows pulled in big ratings, so why not go back to the well again and again and again, which is exactly what the show did.
I don't want to hurt you. I'd like to think the feeling's mutual.
People also know the Fembots, but they appeared more on the Bionic Woman series, and in only one episode of $6 Million Man, the middle episode of a 3-part crossover story called Kill Oscar. Spoilers, they don't. Another mad scientist creates duplicate robots who are lifelike apart from their faces constantly falling off, since apparently duct tape did not exist.
This is a mere warning, because now I have the weather control system.
And finally, there was Death Probe, which is as ridiculous as it sounds. Apparently an autonomous Soviet exploration vehicle designed to withstand the hostile conditions on Venus crashes on Earth and wants to demolish everything. Like the guy who got drunk and bought a wrecking ball on eBay and now tries to justify the purchase by offering to knock down your shed. Death Probe was an opponent that Steve couldn't defeat using brute force alone. It was a success and brought back again in the show's final year.
The pressure inside the space probe is like a wall of granite, shoring up the probe's skin. And all we need to do to finish the job is get it to a higher altitude.
We define success of a $6 Million Man episode by whether A, they could get a spin-off out of it, B, it has multi-part episodes, and C, whether you could get a toy out of it. After the 4th season, there was a contract dispute with Lee Majors, and there was a chance he might not return for the show's 5th season. But return he did. Executive producer Harve Bennett stepped back, with new producers running the series, including co-producer Fred Freiberger, the man responsible for the much maligned final seasons of both Star Trek and Space 1999. The final season amps up spectacle in the hopes of attracting big audiences with 2-parters and more Bigfoot and Death Probe, but without the Bionic Woman crossovers now that the 2 shows were on competing networks. The plots were generally a little more layered and slightly less simplistic than previous years. Not always better, but it still had the series' trademark charm.
You look at him with love in your eyes. His face was like mine.
It was all starting to get a bit much, and at the end of the 1977-78 season, $6 Million Man was done. The Bionic Woman also ended that season, and that was it for 2 cultural icons.
All night, just the 2 of us, and nothing to do.
Well, we'll have to think of something, won't we?
I already have.
For a show that was basically produced on a production line by different directors, producers and writers, and made in an era of self-contained episodes, the $6 Million Man actually has pretty consistent internal continuity for the most part. When a similar character is needed for an episode, they would cast the same actor rather than have a totally new character each time.
I suppose you really are in love with me?
Peggy, I was pretending.
Oscar's occasional secretary, Peggy Callahan, is easily the most irritating character in the $6 Million Man series. She's not ditzy or incompetent, but just a little neurotic and highly irritating, like when you get ground glass in your eye.
Oh, my dear. I think I'm gonna faint.
Don't go soft on me, Callahan.
The show's science also stayed relatively consistent, with Steve's abilities and weaknesses generally kept on an even keel. He couldn't suddenly fly or shoot frickin' laser beams from his eyes. But, now that I've said that out loud, I immediately want to know why he couldn't shoot frickin' laser beams from his eyes. There are some moments that are somewhat ridiculous, like capturing a big cat, or capturing an eagle, or preventing the Liberty Bell from being destroyed by a bomb with help from Chuck Connors. Or there's the time Steve Austin was beating up some villains when George Foreman shows up to help out.
That right hand of yours, what is it made of? Iron?
Not exactly, but you're close.
Lee Majors later fronted another series, the goofy stuntman turned bounty hunter drama The Fall Guy, and Lindsay Wagner appeared in dozens of TV movies and miniseries before Majors, Wagner, Richard Anderson and Martin Brooks were brought together again in 3 reunion TV movies, broadcast between 1987 and 1994. Although saddled with some of the cheesiest soap opera style dialogue imaginable and some questionable continuity, it was great to see the cast together again on screen. Also, someone finally made a joke about a bionic penis.
I wonder what parts are bionic.
Lee Majors has more dialogue and emoting in the first movie than practically the entire 5-season run of $6 Million Man. Steve and Jamie married in the final movie, and there were more people having accidents and being rebuilt into bionic people in each movie, such as Steve Austin's previously unmentioned estranged son, who now does have a frickin' laser beam in his eye. The Bionic Woman had a short-lived remake in 2007, and there's been a long-in-development movie, with the cost now at $6 billion, which I suppose isn't that bad for 50 years of inflation.
You see, if I'm right, Jamie may never be bionic again.
Just keep her alive, Doc.
Something I've enjoyed doing in these reviews is pointing out some of the guest stars in the series. Apart from the familiar character actors who did guest shots in everything back then, there are appearances by Britt Eklund, David McCallum, Sonny Bono in some of the most cornball antics ever committed to film, a young Kim Basinger, William Shatner as someone possessed not of super intelligence, but he was super bright.
A sudden stab or something. Thought my spacesuit conked out.
Jenny Agutter, George Foreman, Chuck Connors, Lou Gossett Jr., John Saxon, John Houseman, Robert Loggia, George Takei, Martine Beswick. Even Star Trek's John Delancey shows up in some small roles. The author of the book the series was based on, Martin Caidin, even appears in a small role. The TV reunion movies even have Bryan Cranston as a doctor in one, Sandra Bullock, who became Bionic in the second movie. And of course, Farrah Fawcett appeared in 4 episodes as 3 different characters, an astronaut, a plucky reporter, and a con woman, billed as Farrah Fawcett Majors, as she was famously married to Lee Majors during the 70s, just before her own star blew up with Charlie's Angels and a poster.
I have the unique capability of doing both. Like now. I'm enjoying both.
I found the episodes where Steve Austin wasn't the only science fiction element in the episode often hold up the best these days, compared with, say, Steve Austin wearing a fake beard taking down a moonshine racket just by busting up the joint.
It's been fun, lots of laughs, Jamie. It always is when friends meet again.
It's not hyperbole to say that the $6 Million Man was a big thing in the 1970s. I mean, so were disco and Watergate, but no one's selling 50-year-old Richard Nixon dolls today on eBay. But as the series was so popular, the $6 Million toy line from Kenner was also very successful. The $6 Million Man doll, or action figure if you must, also made an appearance in the actual series. It's not that meta since they don't draw attention to it, but now that you know it's there, you just can't unsee it. I grew up in the tail end of the $6 Million Man's popularity. Everyone I knew the Bionic Man, which is how I, and I presume others, remembered the $6 Million Man. It's a fun time capsule of the 1970s, from the fashions, the fads, and a style of TV action adventure that was enjoyed by millions around the world, and provided a template for many sci-fi themed shows of the next couple of decades. Steve Austin was the coolest guy on TV in the 1970s, and he and Jamie were heroes to millions. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.